From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Oncology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Oncology.
Hello, everyone. This is Vivek Subbiah, medical oncologist and early phase clinical trialist, Chief of Early Phase Drug Development at Sarah Cannon Research Institute, Nashville, Tennessee. I'm also the web editor for JAMA Oncology. Today, it is my pleasure to host Dr. Lee Jones from the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He is the lead author for the paper, a Phase 1A Decentralized Trial of Neoadjuvant Exercise Therapy in Prostate Cancer. Dr. Jones, it's a pleasure to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Lee Jones. I'm a PhD exercise researcher. I run a program at Memorial Sloan Kettering called the Exercise Oncology Program, and we do clinical trials looking at the efficacy and mechanisms of exercise in solid tumor oncology.
All right, it's so great to have you, Dr. Jones. And for the purposes of this podcast, both of us are going to be addressing each other by first name. So Lee has published in this area, including a comprehensive review article in JAMA Oncology, Development of Exercise as Intercession Therapy for Cancer. And as an early phase clinical trialist, the title and topic was really interest to me because this was not a drug. So what we know about physical activity and exercise. So despite a considerable body of observational evidence and guidelines from multiple international agencies, the prescription of exercise therapy is not considered the standard of care for individuals at risk or for individuals with cancer. So what is physical activity? Physical activity is defined by the World Health Organization as any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that requires energy expenditure, whereas exercise is defined as a subcategory of physical activity consisting of planned, structured, repetitive, and purposeful movement. So most observational studies to date assess physical activity rather than exercise. So what are we discussing today? Emerging research suggests that exercise therapy may have potential as an effective strategy against solid tumor in patients with cancer. In JAMA Oncology, Dr. Lee Jones and team have published a paper, a Phase 1A decentralized trial of neoadjuvant exercise therapy in prostate cancer. So, Dr. Lee Jones, what was the purpose of the study?
Yeah, thanks so much, Vivek. We published a review paper in the journal JAMA Oncology a couple of years ago where we're trying to really dissect the development of exercise as an anti-tumor strategy, not exercise on things like patient-reported endpoints or physiologic endpoints, but is exercise an effective therapy for cancer itself? And so I think if you apply that lens, as you mentioned, there's been a number of epidemiological studies that have linked exercise to reduce risk of both prostate cancer mortality as well as prostate cancer progression, suggesting that there might be evidence of clinical benefit here. But of course, you need to do the phase 2 randomized trials or the phase 3 randomized trial to really prove that. And so we felt, if we're moving in that direction, of course, as you would with any drug, you'd want to know what is the right dose of exercise that we need to be testing and carry forward in these larger studies. And I didn't think we had a very good answer to that. So we designed this phase 1 trial, like you would a phase 1 trial for a new drug, to identify the overall purpose, which was what is the recommended phase 2 dose of exercise? If we do move forward to a larger definitive trial, then we would know the optimal dose in which to test.
Very interesting. So again, how was the feasibility of exercise therapy assessed in the trial?
Yeah, so it was interesting. I read a lot of phase 1 trials of drug development to try and get a handle on how could we apply drug development metrics to the study of exercise. And of course, it doesn't go one for one. Of course, with a phase 1 trial of a drug, you might be looking for the maximum tolerated dose, the MTD. And I didn't think the MTD was appropriate for something like exercise. You would need a massive dose of exercise. You're not looking to look at the dose of exercise that would be eventually become toxic for an individual. I didn't feel that that was ethical. So what we did instead is we started to look for the maximum feasible dose of exercise. So what does that mean? Well, in an exercise trial, you can measure that by compliance, adherence. That will give you a very good measure of feasibility. Now, in a lot of exercise studies, they'll measure compliance as defined by attendance. So we're looking for an individual to attend, let's say, 3 sessions of exercise per week. And then if the individual turns up, they would consider 100% adherence for that particular session. But as we know, if somebody turns up at their clinical appointment, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get all the dose that you recommended them to get, the planned dose on that particular day. And we felt this was important. So what we do is we measure something called the relative dose intensity of exercise, like you would with a drug. We know precisely what the planned dose of exercise for every given session. We then measure and quantify exactly what the individual did in that planned session. So we're able to calculate the relative dose intensity. So that's how we measured. We basically created a new metric for the measurement of compliance of exercise in this particular study.
That's fascinating. Again, as an early phase clinical trialist, right? The maximum tolerated dose, I think personally, is a precept from the chemotherapy era. So where we wanted to identify the maximum tolerated dose. Currently, in the precision oncology era, with targeted therapies, immunotherapies, bispecific antibodies, and antibody drug conjugates, even in early phase clinical trial drug development, we are moving away from the maximum tolerated dose to optimal biological dose and etc. So the fact that you mentioned maximum feasible dose, relative dose intensity, again, resonates with the current paradigm of early phase drug development as well. So in that veins, in your own words, what were the main findings regarding the tumor biological activity of exercise therapy?
We basically took a leaf out of drug development paradigms with modern therapy, with contemporary therapy, to both consider feasibility in the context of biological activity. So the first, I guess, finding from a feasibility standpoint is we set feasibility at a threshold. At least 70% of individuals in every dosing level or dosing cohort, and in this particular study, we had 6 escalated doses of exercise going from as low as 90 minutes a week all the way up to 450 minutes of exercise per week. And these are all individuals who are inactive at baseline. So these are not individuals who are already exercising. So we defined feasibility or adequate feasibility as at least 70% of individuals in each dosing level at an adherence level or a relative dose intensity of exercise of at least 75%. So we wanted a pretty rigorous threshold of what we considered adequate compliance to be in each dosing level. So the first finding was that we found, and to my surprise, quite honestly, that all the dose levels were feasible. In other words, all men who came into this trial were able to achieve the relative dose intensity threshold. So that was the first finding, which to me was surprising because 450 minutes of exercise is a lot of exercise, but these men were extremely compliant and extremely motivated. So that's the first finding. In terms of biological activity, we measured 2 endpoints. The first thing we measured was PSA, changes in plasma PSA from before to after exercise in the pre-surgical setting. The second thing we measured was tumor cell proliferation through Ki-67, measured in the diagnostic biopsy at baseline and then measured again from the surgical resection. So what we found is, from a biological perspective, I think was quite interesting. The lower doses in this context, 90 and 150 minutes, really didn't have much biological efficacy at all. And it wasn't until you got to 225 minutes of exercise per week that you started to see reductions both in PSA as well as in Ki-67. So that was interesting. You don't start to see the efficacy until 225. What was additionally interesting is when you went to 300, 375 minutes of exercise per week, there was also activity in those 2 dose levels. But in my opinion, the activity level was no greater, the magnitude was no greater than 225. And when you get to 450, there really wasn't very much efficacy activity at all. So I think for us, it was very interesting. All doses are feasible. You don't see the activity benefit until you get to 225, but higher doses were not more efficacious.
Wow, that is fascinating. As an early phase clinical trialist myself, in the field of oncology drug development, the recommended phase 2 dose, or the RP2D, is determined through empirical dose finding phase 1 studies. However, comparable trials of exercise therapy have not been conducted in any setting. So it was intriguing to me to see how one can conduct phase 1 trials of exercise therapy to establish the optimal dose and guide the development of this promising anti cancer strategy. So, how was the recommended phase 2 dose of exercise therapy determined here? Again, it'd be great for the readers to get a broad context on this.
Yeah, again, as in contemporary phase 1 drug development, we wanted to consider both feasibility and biological activity. So, of course, with something like exercise, there's no point having a huge dose of exercise if nobody could do it, if adherence is so poor, like a drug. If a drug's very efficacious, but the toxicity is so high, that's not what you really want. So we were looking for the same thing. What is a level of exercise that these men could accomplish at high fidelity with good adherence, but also there's a biological signal, in this context, a reduction in PSA and Ki-67. So we put both of those elements together. Now, all doses were feasible, so that took care of that. So we can consider all doses for biological activity. And again, my read on this is certainly 90 and 150 minutes. 150 minutes is actually kind of interesting because that's the current recommended ASCO guidelines for exercise for individuals with cancer. In this particular study, 150 minutes really had no activity whatsoever, at least in the endpoints that we looked at. And so again, when we got to 225, you started to see these significant reductions in PSA and Ki-67, but higher doses were not associated with a greater magnitude of benefit. And so you don't see this dose response as, we typically think with exercise, more is better, but that certainly wasn't the case here. So considering both feasibility and biological activity, we selected 225 minutes as the recommended phase 2 dose. Now, one could argue that 300, 375 had similar biological activity, and I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But the reality is, of course, this is exercise. So going from 225 to 300 minutes, 375 minutes, that's a lot of additional time for a patient to be exercising per week. And I'm not saying that there wouldn't be potentially additional benefits from maybe a patient-reported endpoint or for other endpoints, but at least from a cancer-specific endpoint, we felt that there was no need really to go any higher than 225. So we selected 225 as the recommended phase 2 dose.
Brilliant take on that. So moving on, this is a phase 1 study, right?
Yes.
What were the safety considerations and adverse events observed during this phase 1 study? Again, phase 1 trials of primary purpose is for safety and toxicity, right? So what were the safety consideration and adverse events observed during this trial?
Yeah, so I guess what we haven't mentioned yet is the way we administered exercise in this study. Just to provide a bit of context, if you think about most exercise studies, to deliver and test exercise at a high fidelity, what have we done over the past 50 years in all exercise trials, both in oncology and beyond? It would be bringing individuals into a fitness facility or a medical facility, and then you watch those individuals, exercise on a bike or a treadmill, because you want to ensure that the planned dose of exercise has been delivered at high compliance. I felt that's certainly been a reasonable approach, but that really limits the kind of doses that you can test, because at the end of the day, individuals are only going to be able to willing to come into a center so many times per week. And certainly traveling into Manhattan with us at Memorial Sloan Kettering was going to be a significant challenge to try and do one of these phase 1 trials. So we developed this fully decentralized approach, which in brief basically involves us shipping a treadmill to the patient's home. These treadmills come with an iPad, and then we use different video conferencing platforms. And then our team watches the individual do the exercise session. So we can not only prescribe that exercise session to that individual at every single session, so they know exactly what they're going to do, but of course, then we can accurately quantify exactly what that individual did. So that's really important, because that really allows us to test these higher doses that wouldn't have been possible with the traditional, if you will, site-based approach of exercise. But of course, at the same time, we can now monitor any adverse events that occur during the exercise sessions. And I'm pleased to report we would monitor events and then we would report these events through CTC-AE, just like you would any drug trial. And we're pleased to report we didn't observe any serious adverse events of individuals in any dose level. There were several lower grade events like grade 1, grade 2 events, things like hypertension, tachycardia, fatigue, and other events, but we experienced and observed no grade 3 events.
Thank you so much. So for the listeners, what are the implications of the study's findings for the use of exercise therapy in localized prostate cancer? And do you have any closing statements?
So the implications, I think it's interesting. As you mentioned, there's certainly observational data suggesting that higher levels of exercise following the diagnosis of several solid tumors, including prostate cancer, is associated with reduced risk of cancer mortality. On the basis of that data, various organizations now recommend exercise for all individuals with cancer. So I think in that context, if an oncologist or physician was interested in recommending a level of exercise to an individual with prostate cancer, I think our data might provide some guidance on what that recommendation might be. And if certainly there's been several randomized control trials that have looked at the symptom control benefits of exercise improving fatigue, quality of life, fitness, and other physiological endpoints. And so, I think our trial is in that context. Now, from an anti-cancer perspective, we're still in very early stages of development. Our data is the first data suggesting there's a biological signal for exercise, which I think is very exciting. But of course, this is not a slam dunk. We now need to actually prove there's preliminary clinical efficacy of exercise in the setting of localized prostate cancer. We certainly haven't proven that yet. So I think the implications are, I think these certainly add to the existing data that we have suggesting exercise might be beneficial following a localized prostate cancer for many different reasons, and may provide some guidance on what that dose of exercise would be. I'm a little bit more hesitant on the cancer side of things. And I think, we've got a promising early signal here, but that of course is not proven at all. And we need to do the phase 2 trials to actually prove that exercise has a clinical benefit from a cancer perspective in this setting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. So far, JAMA Oncology listeners who are tuning in this decentralized phase 1A non-randomized controlled trial that included 53 men in the preoperative setting, all exercise therapy dose levels were feasible with 225 to 375 minutes per week, showing promising biological activity. So what is the message for listeners? 225 minutes per week was selected as a recommended phase 2 dose, which is around 32 minutes per day. So, but further evaluation of exercise therapy at the identified recommended phase 2 dose is warranted in prostate and all other solid tumors. So it was terrific to hear from the lead author of the study. I am Vivek Subbiah, and I've been speaking with Dr. Lee Jones from the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center about phase 1A decentralized trial of neoadjuvant exercise therapy in prostate cancer. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thanks for listening.